Take your Bibles, if you would, and turn to Ephesians chapter 6 with me. I did notice, George, you stepped up with some Adidas shoe game, I noticed, for the occasion. That's really respectable move on your part. One quick announcement. I mentioned last week, but we're getting down the final time. If you have not signed up to join us for our celebration banquet on the 24th for Lifeline's 20 years, don't wait after today. You need to get signed up. So please do make sure that you're there and can join us and celebrate with us. We really hope to have a bunch of you there and a part of things. All right? You may, on the way out, in between services, we've got somebody doing a little video work, and they may stop and ask you a question or two. And if so, you answer as the Lord leads. All right? We'll just leave it at that. I'm going to pray. I know we've prayed a bunch, but we're the church, so it's okay. But we're going to just commit the word to the Lord this morning. Lord, as we have a little bit of a shorter time in your word this morning, we're optimistic that you'll speak to us because you told us it wouldn't come back to us, that wouldn't return rather to you void. And so we're hopeful that you would have just something in the text for us, something that the Spirit could take and apply to our hearts, something that could move us to the next sort of step in our lives. We're not presumptuous of what that might be, but every time we open your word, there's gold to be had. So we want to live submissively under it. We want to attend to it. We want our lives to square with it, Lord. And I just pray that you would help me to communicate clearly and simply. Lord, the lives that we bring to you are cluttered. They're cluttered lives. As Augustine pointed out, we spend our life running toward you sometimes, whether we even know it or not. And we spend, paradoxically, sometimes the same time running away from you. We're chaotic people. Lord, and I pray that you would help us to turn to you, to align with you, to find our life in you this morning. And Lord, so we just pray that you would help us. And we invite you into our clutter. In Jesus' name, amen. So we've been studying Ephesians. We're going to continue. We're right in that context. But I need to sort of set this text in context in an important way for you, both in terms of its literary context, but also its cultural context. Some of you that have been with us for a little while will remember that we spent time in Ephesians 4:28, and we talked about work. And so you might go, oh, here we are again. And the answer is yes. And that's because through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and the Apostle Paul, we're here again. But we're here in a little bit of a different way because the context is a little bit different. In chapter 4, it was clear that it was just about the process of doing honest work. But the context now has shifted a bit to a little bit more of a focus on what I'm going to call it the workplace, but I want to explain why we're going to call it that. So remember, going all the way back to chapter 4, remind each time, we're talking about a new way of doing life built upon the gospel. That's the last half of Ephesians. And along the way, we've seen all these various pieces, but we got to the latter part of chapter 5, and it shifted to, I've referred to it sometimes as like a household codes. There's a German word, Haustafel. That word is a word that refers to the relationships and how relationships function within a domestic setting. So what you have to understand is that when we talk about this text strictly within its historical context, it actually isn't outside of the domestic realm. It's actually inside in the ancient world. It's part of what was called the house d'Ophel. So you had the relationship between a husband and a wife, the latter portion of chapter 5. You had the relationship between parents and children, first part of chapter 6. And now you have slaves and masters, and when we see that, it causes all kinds of oddities for a number of reasons. And we have to go back into that world and understand sort of slavery in that context. Part of the problem that we face is that when I speak of slave and master, naturally our minds go to what appeared in American history, the antebellum South. And we think in terms of sort of that kind of captivity, that kind of restraint, that kind of, that level of indentured servitude and so forth, and that kind of treatment, and that kind of subjugation. And it's not accurate historically for us to just simply take the sum total of antebellum slavery in the United States, set it back on the biblical text, and say, can you believe the Bible is endorsing slavery? Interestingly, you should just note that when Paul talks a couple different times, one when his appeal to Philemon, in the little letter of Philemon, he longs for him to be incredibly benevolent to Onesimus. He actually tells in 1 Corinthians, he'll speak about slaves, if you can get your freedom, get your freedom. So let's understand what was happening in the ancient world first. It's estimated that there were probably in the Roman Empire around 60 million slaves. So what you need to understand is that slaves were not a small portion of the population. They were an enormous portion of the population. Every household, for the most part, had slaves. Slaves functioned in a variety of ways. Yes, you had slaves who were doing grunt-type labor tasks, but you had slaves that functioned as teachers, slaves that functioned as accountants, you had slaves that functioned as guardians, you had slaves that functioned in legal arenas. So you had slaves that functioned in a variety of ways within. It's almost like slaves were a kind of class of persons. By the time we roll around to the first century, slaves, for the most part, many were able to purchase their freedom. It was kind of a matter of course, such that it would be maybe unusual, we could say that way, that a slave might be a slave for their whole life. They would be able often to purchase their freedom. So slavery sort of had a kind of class structure within society. And the text of the New Testament is entering that. Paul is individually speaking about treatment, partly because the ethic, by the way, in the New Testament is always not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And what do I mean by that? I mean, as much as we want to look, and I get why sometimes, although I frankly think it's a little bit, sometimes we get a little Sisyphean, rolling a rock up a hill and it comes back down on us philosophically when we do it this way. We spend a lot of time complaining and griping about government, trying to reform government and all those kind of things. And there's a place for that, there's a place for lobbying, there's a place for all that. But understand that the ethic of the New Testament is not, here's how you lobby your government. You'll search through the scriptures trying to find that. The ethic is not how you go and change the top and work your way down to the bottom. And if we could just fix the top, everything would be different. The ethic of the New Testament is look inside your own heart, look inside your heart, look inside your heart, look inside your heart, look inside your heart. And after a while, what happens is the molecular transformation that happens across the board in its individuated capacities rises up now, and from the bottom up, culture gets changed. But culture doesn't get changed unless hearts get changed. So the New Testament's appeal is not to the cultural construct. The New Testament's appeal is to the individual, like Paul appealing to Philemon, like Paul saying, if you can get your freedom, get your freedom. And this is how the New Testament approaches the issue in that time. Now, I mention this is the workplace because this is the best arena in which we can take that construct and we can find application, because it was without question the big sort of churning wheel, if we want to say, of economic employment structure within the context of the Roman Empire. And so exhortations given within this last part sort of sit in a world that we don't have a lot of familiarity with. So in one sense, it's a household code. But in another sense, for our application, it applies best to the context of the workplace. And so we're going to apply it that way. We're going to apply it that way. Now, what we're going to do is there's a Latin phrase I'll teach you called a fortiori. A fortiori. It's a phrase that if you read literature, sometimes it'll show up. And there's nothing wrong with in church learning a new term. Okay? A fortiori. It means to argue from the lesser to the greater. To argue from the lesser to the greater. If this is true, how much more should this be the case? How much more should this be the case? So we want to kind of think about it in those terms. If it's true in the terms of a kind of indentured servitude dynamic within the domestic realm of that Roman culture, how much more should it be true of a Christian when a Christian is in exercise of their freedom? Should they feel the weight of the moral responsibility to act appropriately? So what we're going to do is, because of limited time, I'm going to go pretty quick, and we're going to kind of just work down through. You're going to see 6 characteristics, call it, of the new way of working. And they're pretty evident right in the text. There's different grammatical forms they take, and I elected in this message to not really perseverate too much on the grammatical forms that they take. Sometimes they show up as phrases, or sometimes just as nouns or participles and different things. But we're going to look at that, verses 5 through 8, and then we're going to flip the script and just briefly at the end think a little bit about the one who is in charge of people. Because so we have both, on the one hand, slaves, those who are working, those who are reporting to someone. If you are reporting to someone, which in one level or capacity is probably almost everyone, then you need to pay attention in this first part. If you are overseeing anybody at all, then we pay attention in the latter part. But I think the principles kind of cross over a bit. One final thing I want to mention to you. Let's say that you split the difference between men and women. I think women, you guys outlive us by a couple of years or a year and a half. I don't know why. I think it's because you cause us more stress than we cause you. Can I get a name? No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, men live to, like in the U.S., I think right now it's like 78 and a half. On average, some of you, and that's, by the way, you take heart in those ratings. You're like 70, you're like, man, let me take heart, because, that all factors in, people, infant mortality and all that kind of stuff. So if you're rocking it at 70, we're going to see you for a long time still. But you average it out, 78 and a half, something like that for a guy, 80. So we're going to pick the middle, take 79 years, okay? So let's say you have 79 years. It's kind of weird when you think about it that you'll spend a third of that. You'll spend 25 years sleeping. Like, we're all like was it Rip Van Winkle or whatever? You're going to spend, that's a lot of time sleeping, right? You're going to spend about a third of your life sleeping. So that leaves you from that, let's say, a little over 50 years, 52, 53 years. You're going to spend 14 and a half years working of your life. 14 and a half years. That's a large percentage of your awake time. You're going to spend almost a third of your time that you're awake working. So when you think about what it means to be a Christian in the context of where you work, it becomes pretty significant. It's a pretty big portion of your life. And so a lot of times we probably don't spend near enough time talking about what it looks like to be a Christian in that place. And partly because you'll never know who's watching, people always are, and you never know what opportunities will creep up and when they will creep up, and you never know in what ways God has the potential to receive honor and glory in those contexts. So to that end, let's think about 6 characteristics of the new way of working. Look at your Bibles. We're going to read verse 5 of chapter 6 through verse 9. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he'll receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. First characteristic, act with respect. Act with respect toward those you work for. Look at your text. Obey is the central verb. It's an imperative. It's the same obey that comes back when you're talking about children obeying your parents. Hupakuo, to hear under, to listen under, right? To listen under. So it has the idea of a submissive posture and an attentive posture. Obey your earthly masters. And then you get the description with fear and trembling. About 4 times or so in the New Testament, you get that kind of descriptor. Doing something with fear and trembling. Sometimes it's Paul doing ministry and he's getting ready to share the gospel and he does it with fear and trembling. And we should wonder what's meant by that. Should you go into the workplace just biting your nails and all filled with anxiety over what you're about to do? You might go in like that, but that's not what the call is, to go in like that. The point is that you go in and you have, I think the best way for us to think about fear and trembling coupled together, looking at its other usages, is a deep, profound respect, but it is not just a respect in the sense of kind of a, well, I respect them. You know, it's sort of like when you say to somebody, with all due respect, you're about to say something disrespectful, right? So not to offend you, but here we go. It's not that kind of a nod. It's a respect that is ready to act in correspondence to the nature of the respect that's actually bestowed upon the individual. So the challenge, of course, you face is that some of you work for people and you go, they're hard for me to respect. They're hard for you to respect. And I want to just give you the discouraging encouragement that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That oftentimes the commands of the New Testament that are given like this, that are upline kind of things, it's like the command in 1 Peter 2 where it says, honor the king. I used to hear people always say, well, it means honor the office, not the man. No, it doesn't. What are you talking about? If it said honor the office, guess what it would say? Honor the office. But it doesn't say that. It says honor the king. It's the person in charge, right? And so here it's given without qualification. You're just to respect. You're just to respect. I remember doing this really poorly in one of my first jobs. I worked at the YMCA. At the service desk. So when you came into the YMCA and you went downstairs, you had to go downstairs to go through this kind of secondary checkpoint where you could go a couple of places. One, you could go where the members, kind of the old guys that sort of sit in saunas and stink, go. and they sit over there and chew the fat and shoot the bull. And then, or you could go up to where the young bucks go, up to the gym and work out or play basketball. And you could get your towel. They had a little thing behind that sell product, but nobody ever bought any, but it was just there for show, you know. But basically, it was in upstate New York, so I was giving basically Italian Vinny and Gino their towel for their 8th sauna of the day, all right? And I'm there working away, and I was dating this girl at the time who I had dated all through high school, thought I was going to marry her, and she called me from out of state and broke up with me on the phone. That's when you go, oh. So anyway, she broke up with me, crushed my heart, just took it like a cookie and just crumbled it right there at the service desk at the YMCA while Gino wants his towel. I'm about ready to whip Gino with it. So I am all of 18 years old, certainly wildly mature in relationships, well within myself to control my own emotions, and I just begin to lose it. I mean, I'm bawling like a baby at the service desk. So I turn around, I go in the back, and there was this long-haired guy. I mean, his hair came all the way down to his rear end, named Chuck. And Chuck was in the back, and Chuck was a fine guy. He was no rocket scientist, but he was a fine guy. And Chuck's in the back, and I said, Chuck, what, dude? Okay, man. I said, I can't stay, I gotta go. So I left. I just left. And I asked Chuck to cover the service desk. So my supervisor was a guy that I'd known for a long time. He was the guy that got me the job. And he suspended me for 2 weeks from the job. Well, clearly, he didn't know heartbreak. He had no idea what I was dealing with. He didn't know what it was like to have the girl crush you. And so this unfeeling monster who suspended me for 2 weeks from leaving my post didn't get it. And I let him know that he didn't get it. Didn't understand what was going on in my deep. And I remember going like this, and walking away from him. Right? He should have just fired me then, put me in the stocks, put me out of my misery. But he didn't. He was patient with me, and I was able to go back after a couple of weeks. But I was disrespectful. I didn't start off well. And I always remember looking back at that and thinking, what an absolute little jerk. He should have just spanked me right there. He should have spanked me. When you get something you don't want at your job, not a suspension probably, but you don't get the raise, right? You don't get the raise. I mean, it's not Christmas vacation. You don't get to send Cousin Eddie over to kidnap him, bring him over, make sure you get your bonus, right? Like, how do you respond when you don't get what you want? How do you respond when you're asked to do something that you don't want to do? When you're asked to do something that you feel like isn't within the purview of this moment? Granted, you may have to talk it through with your employer. I understand that. That's important. But do you respond with a sense of respect? This is what he's after. Come to the context with a sense of respect. Number 2, have focused integrity in your work. Do you see the word sincerity? With a sincere heart. In Greek, that term means, it comes from 2 words that came together, and the word means to fold together like a towel. If you had 2 towels and you folded them together, if you had a couple of pieces of paper and you folded them together, what's he getting at when he says sincerity? Here's probably a more precise way of translating it. Singleness. Singleness is the idea. The idea is that when you come to work, do you have a singleness, and a couple of fronts. Number 1, do you have a singleness of focus? Is your attention present? Is your attention present? The second is, a different kind of duplicity, but character-wise, character-logical? Are you the kind of person that is a whole person in all the tasks that you're about? We'll talk a little bit more about that and how it shows up in a moment. But right now, I just want you to ask that question of yourself. Are you singular, or do you come and do you find yourself that when tasks emerge that you're not predisposed to do, there's a kind of a half of you that shows up, but not an all of you that shows up? How's your character show up? Here, the idea is a sincerity of heart. Look at your text again, number 3. With a sincere heart, and then you get this phrase shows up 3 times, and then you'll kind of see in the early portion of verse 6, as you would Christ. So it's assuming that if Jesus were the one who wrote your job description, you would attend to it maybe better than you would an inconsistent boss. Okay? That as a Christian, you would assume that you would have a kind of yes, sir, a kind of attention, a kind of responsibility, a kind of passion that might be different than if you were speaking to just a person, just a human, a mere human in that sense. As you would Christ, it says, not by the way of eye service. It actually is a compound word. We get the first part ophthalmological from, and the last part doulos, which is service. Only shows up in Colossians 3:22, which is the parallel text to this. Same with the next term, as people pleasers. It only shows up in Colossians 3:22. But as bondservants of Christ. So he said before, as you would Christ, as bondservants of Christ. And if you go down to verse 7, you'll see the phrase after the word goodwill, as to the Lord. So you get the idea that your work is always to be viewed as to the Lord, not to the exclusion of the person. Not to the exclusion where you sort of work for the Lord despite the jerk, but rather that you look through the jerk. And you look through them and you say, how does God want me to work with jerks in power? How does he want me to work with people who might not have the character of the master, so to speak, that'll be described in a bit, but how might God want me to work in relation to them? Colossians 3:17. Again, Colossians 3, the beginning of verse 4, run parallel to this passage. Whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord, just Jesus giving thanks to God the Father through him. So the question is, like, when you work, who's your audience? Who's your audience? Do you see yourself privately? Maybe you work from home and you only report via Zoom. Do you see yourself as checking in, giving your time? If you're paid for full-time employment, you really work full-time employment. You really give your all to it all when you're there and when you're present. I love this quote from the great theologian Michael Scott. Do I need to be liked? Absolutely not. I like to be liked. I enjoy being liked. I have to be liked. But it's not like a compulsive need to be liked, like my need to be praised. Sometimes we can be people who have a hard time working if we're not consistently, regularly, sometimes even incessantly, getting affirmed by other people around us. We need that. Now, every good employer should encourage. So this isn't to say that encouragement and attaboys and things that come along and speak well of what you're doing are insignificant and don't matter. But it is to say that if your job is related to them, if you say, I work at a place that's a thankless place. Okay, what does that mean? I think you mean that it's thankless from the earthly master. Do you see it as thankless from the Lord? And if you see it as thankless from the Lord, that has, in one sense, almost nothing to do with what you're doing. It has almost nothing to do with your job. It has everything to do with how you frame the you that is happening to your job. Because here's the thing, you'll carry that in other places in the house to fell. Now, you'll carry that into your relationship with your spouse. You'll carry that into your relationship with your kids. And you will live feeling like you put something out and you served and you didn't get a thank you card. Can you believe that? How pathetic and rude those people are. They never even wrote me a thank you note. Well, I didn't know that's why you did it. I didn't. It's just that they need to have some. Why? Why? Because you have an expectation? No, listen. You do it before the audience of one. For am I now seeking the approval of man? This is after Paul is bringing the wood to the Galatians. Or of God. Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I'd not be a servant of Christ. I won't. And here's the parallel over in the application over to the workplace. It's that if you are trying to live in that work dynamic for the pleasure of those around you, you actually won't be able to serve the Lord. You won't be able to push through and do it. And it's not because there's something inherently wrong with you wanting your boss to be pleased with you. I think it would be inordinate if you didn't want your boss to feel good about you. I think you'd probably like that, and that's a good thing. We all would like that. It's not that. It's just that he's a sinner and he's inconsistent. But the Lord's not. The Lord's not. And you need a kind of plumb line that comes down from glory, not one that comes down from the office upstairs to guide you, to anchor you in that way. A couple other quotes that I think are important on this wise. Os Guinness, who wrote a book called The Call about vocation, says this: "We who live before the audience of one can say to the world, I have only one audience. Before you, I have nothing to prove, nothing to gain, nothing to lose." That means that you don't have to be afraid. That means you don't have to fear about your employment or your employer if you can have that kind of mindset. In a non-theological way, I just love the quote from Churchill: "Nothing is more dangerous than to live in the temperamental atmosphere of a gallops pole, always feeling one's pulse and taking one's temperature." You walk through life going, is everybody happy with me? I don't want to upset anybody. I want to make sure everybody's pleased with me. You want something that'll drive you clinically insane. Approach your work like that. Instead, it is always, always, always to the Lord. Now, look back. It says at the end of verse 6, doing the will of God. Doing the right things, that's the will of God. So here the will of God is not, am I doing this in Utah or am I doing this in Wisconsin? It's not, am I doing this at Corporation X or Corporation Y? It's, am I doing the thing that honors God? This is something you should make a note of. Not all work is good work. You can't be a prostitute to the glory of God. You can't be a drug dealer to the glory of God. You can't be someone who gouges prices to the honor and glory of the Lord. You can't be somebody that underpays your employees to the glory of God. Just because you raise your market share doesn't mean you don't raise it wickedly. Okay? So, all work isn't good work. All work isn't God. There's work that honestly is just kind of wasteful. You can spend your time doing trivial things that don't really have much of an impact at all. Now, I want to qualify something because some of you could look and think about your life and your career and feel like, well, what am I contributing? And I would encourage you, go on a journey with that and think deeply about that. The reality is, most of you are doing things that contribute hugely. You might be creating things that make business move forward in common grace. You might be contributing to things that supply people with goods for their very livelihood and their very essence. All of these things are not somehow secondary. They're not somehow ministry and eternal things and then these temporal things that we sort of do to get the dollar, and that's what we're sort of working for, like another great theologian, Johnny Paycheck, who told the boss to take the job and shove it, right? And if you read the lyrics of the song, what is it that he opines? It's that he's working, but his woman done left him, and now he's lost everything he was working for. Well, that's his problem. The problem is he's working for the wrong thing. And as he works for the wrong thing, he ends up feeling vacated when that thing leaves and that thing fails him. So most of you are doing great things, but I would encourage you, evaluate it. Evaluate it. Press into it. Do it in such a way that it contributes to the right things and do it in the right way. Do the right things and do them with passion. Do you see the term here? It says, from the heart. It actually is a term that is exukes. Think psychic or your psychiatry. In Greek, suke is the word for soul. Soul, your inner life. Inner life. So the translators have said from the heart, but it's not actually the word for heart. It's literally out of the soul. Out of the basement, so to speak, of your being. Out of the inner life. Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work heartily. Greek, same phrase, ek suke, out of the soul, out of the soul. What does that mean, to work out of your soul? It means, what is it, heartily is kind of a good translation in some ways, because it's an adverbial kind of concept, and it means this, that you're all in. You're all in. Here's what I want you to understand. I do a bunch of teaching with men, and we've done some stuff here. Went through Better Man and talked about how a better man excels at God's work. And one of the things I think that happens in church life, and I understand why, because I want, and the Bible wants you, men, to be really stellar husbands and amazing fathers. The Bible wants you, wives, to be wonderful, wonderful women of the Lord and mothers and wives. Longs for that. So it's not inappropriate for us to place proper emphasis on that. But some of what happens is that when the emphasis is on that, we forget that there's also another side. And the other side is that when you walk into the workplace, you're actually supposed to be all there. You're actually not supposed to be half at home. You're not supposed to be half out into the higher things of life. You actually are to be focused. And you are to be all there for the glory of God. Both are true. You can be an amazing husband and an amazing worker at the same time. You can be an amazing wife and an amazing worker. But you've got to be all in, all in. Whatever you do, work heartily. One who is faithful in very little, Jesus said, is also faithful in much. I emphasize this because sometimes, to go back to where we were about character, you can just give a part of you because the task doesn't demand all of you, right? One who's faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. You can think it's trivial, right? So you all have things you do by rote in your job, and you don't maybe attend to them as you ought. And the key being as you ought. Nothing you do is trivial. Nothing is trivial. Why? Because everything is done with the breath and the vitality as an image bearer of God. I'll give you one illustration, and I could highlight tons of you in this church about this. But there's a guy, John Os Santos, who goes here to church. And you may or may not know, and I don't say it to highlight it. He'd actually be embarrassed that I highlight it. But John O works full-time and works hard all throughout the week. And he, for years, and I mean years, has every Sunday, without any pay, for years, been the guy who stays after for 2 hours after the service on Sunday and cleans up. We have a company that cleans, but they do that Saturday, and so he cleans up for the week for the sake of the staff and the sake of our operations. And he has volunteered faithfully doing that with a wife and with a couple small kids. When he does that, here's the thing about him, and this is why I highlight it, is I see the same Jono if he is investing in verbal or oral ministry of the word in someone's life as he is taking out the trash. The same guy. Because nothing is trivial. Nothing's trivial. He's a good model to me. He's a reminder to me that when I have to do some things that I don't really want to do, I just got to Jono it a little. I got to see what it means to say, no, to the glory of God, I'll be all in. Number 5. Rendering service with a good will. With a good will, as to the Lord and not to man. I want to just briefly mention the point here is that you're not a complainer, you're not resentful, and you're not begrudging. The point here is that you do it, and you don't do it to get through it, but you do it, and you do it with gladness, and the people around you know you do it with gladness. They don't feel like you're taxed to the end. They don't feel like you're just on the cusp of breaking apart. They don't sense that this is the last thing in the world you want to do right now. But darn it all, you are the servant. And you will do it when no one else will do it. No, it's not martyrdom. It's not sacrifice writ large. You're just happy to help. You're just happy to help. I'll put these up real quick. I developed these a few years ago, and we've used them around the office on occasion, and talked about them a little bit when we've talked about work here. But just as a way of reminder, I think there's 5 key choices of what I call a get-to attitude. You can come to a task and you can have to do it, or you get to do it. And big difference. Big difference with everybody if you have to do it. Big difference if you get to do it. If you get to do it, right? Like, can you get to clean out the cat litter? You get to. Why? Like, how can it be that you get to? Well, because if you didn't get to, somebody else might have to. And so your get to eliminates somebody's have to. And that is its own offering to the Lord that can be given with joy and gladness. You get to. So here, quick. We'll just put them up. Number 1, you choose gratitude over groaning. That's the first thing. What are you thankful for and what you get to do? Well, I'm glad I have a scoop and I don't have to use my hand. That's good. That's good. Amen. Gratitude over groaning. Appreciation over apathy. I'm thankful and appreciative for the opportunity rather than that I would rather just sit here and do what? Nothing. I'm not going to be apathetic. It's not enough to just kind of say, oh, well, I'll muster up the will. No, be appreciative that you're the one called on. Enthusiasm over entropy. What do I mean by that? Entropy is what happens when you don't infuse something with energy. It's what happens naturally. This is like our lives are fighting entropy again and again. Your relationship will have entropy. Your performance, a job will have entropy. Your sense of self-worth will have entropy. Your relationship with the Lord will have entropy. That's why you're never in neutral. It's always uphill, and when you put it in neutral, what happens when you go uphill? You go back. You go back. If you drive a manual, you know that to be the case. Instead, you infuse it with enthusiasm because you get to do it. Opportunity over obligation. This is how you see time. Is it chronos, taking your lunch, or is it kairos? You get to give somebody a lunch. Is it taking from you, or is it kairos? It's opportunity. And then finally, number 5, you're resolved to complete the task rather than feeling resentful as you go and have to persevere in doing this because it's too long, it's too much, it's too arduous. It doesn't mean that it's easy. That's why they're choices to make. But here's what I want you to see about them being choices to make. If you don't choose, what's going to happen to you? The right side of this thing, groaning, apathy, entropy, obligation, resentment, that's what will emerge. Nobody has to work at the right side. No one. It comes natural. The left side, that's work. That's work. So you have to work hard at working hard. Remember, I use that quote, Nick Saban, it takes what it takes. It takes what it takes. 5 key choices. And then finally, number 6, do your work with full awareness of God as your rewarder. And you see this in verse 8. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he'll receive back from his boss. Oh, no, it doesn't say that. This he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. If you read it, this he'll receive back from his boss, then you will live on the right side of those choices. But if you know that the Lord is the one who rewards and the Lord is the one who sees. You know, Colossians 3:24-25, that same kind of context, still talking about work. In the parallel, it says, knowing that from the Lord you'll receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done. There's no partiality. I'll come to that word in a moment. Look at what Jesus said. And this is just, you can see these. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. And I wanted to highlight it. I'm not going to read through all the verses. I just want you to see. First one about giving. Second verse about prayer. Third about fasting. Just see what's underlined. That when you give, when you pray, and when you fast, who is it that sees? Not your pastor. Not your spouse. It's God. And that he who sees what you do when nobody is around is the one who rewards you. Because he sees. So you do your job. And you work your job with a good attitude. You work hard with passion. You render that service with a good will. You respect your boss. You do it as to the Lord with a heart that is folded into one, so to speak. That's singular. And you do all of that because the Lord is the one who rewards you. Now, real quick, verse 9. 3 encouragements for those in charge. Look at it. Masters, do the same to them. What's that mean? Masters, obey your servants? No, it doesn't mean that. It would basically nullify the point of the text. It wouldn't even fit. So what's do the same to them? And Harold Honer, great New Testament scholar I sat under, in a commentary he wrote, talks about how it's pretty clear that the same thing that's referred to here is referring to the disposition or the attitude of the servant, the dedication, the passion, the goodwill, right? The goodwill, the as to the Lord. So you, if you're in charge of people, you bring the same kind of thing. Now, how else would I know that that's what the reference is? Well, because you go over to the parallel passage in Colossians, and you'll see, maintain a positive, good, God-honoring attitude towards those in your charge. That's the first thing you've got to do. Maintain that. Look at Colossians 4:1. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly. It's a dispositional adverbial. Make sure you treat them in a way where your disposition is sound, knowing that you also have a master in heaven, knowing that you're not the be-all, end-all, knowing that the buck doesn't stop with you. It stops with him. So you always have an upline in that way. And you always treat people cognizant of your upline. You always treat people with dignity. Talk more about that in just a moment. Secondly, so the first is you carry a positive attitude, good attitude towards them, treating them well in a God-honoring way. Secondly, don't use power as a tool of manipulation. Masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening. I love that. Why? Because you have power. If you are an employer, you have power. You may or may not be able to directly fire your employee. Maybe you write up, maybe you have a system, you have all those things. But you can make that employee's life a living hell in the workplace if you want to. You can make it really difficult for them to do all the things that those first 6 principles laid out if you want to. And your job is to make those as easy as possible. And your job is to not use power as a tool of manipulation. Your job is not to pull out the power card and to sort of twist their arm, get them in a game of corporate mercy where somehow they finally bend their will to yours because you can, and then call yourself a strong, capable, decisive leader. Right? I know people who lead, I know pastors that lead that way, unfortunately. It's not the way to lead at all. My favorite quote in this regard comes from Dallas Willard. In his book, The Great Omission, which is kind of a collection of essays, Willard says, only constant students of Jesus will be given adequate power to fulfill their calling to be God's person for their time and their place in this world. They are the only ones, look at this, they're the only ones who develop the character which makes it safe to have such power. That's it. As a boss, are you safe to have that power? Are you safe? You'll be safe if you have character. But if you're all focused on product, you're not thinking about process. If you're all focused on product, you're not thinking about people. If you're all focused on product and you're not thinking about the you that needs to be developed that happens to the whole system, you won't be safe to have that power. And then finally, be fully aware of how God sees both you and the one working under you. He finishes, masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there's no partiality with him. I just want you to key in on that term, partiality, for a moment. Partiality. It means, in literally, like if you just took the word in its most literal way, the term partiality means to receive the face. To receive the face. It was an idiom, to receive the face. What does that mean? It was an idiom used for how you might see someone beautiful and you might be very sweet and kind and wonderful to them. You might give them a certain benefit. You might see somebody who's not as beautiful and you might not treat them the same way. You might see somebody that's familiar, that's a pleasant face to you. And you might see somebody who's less familiar, or maybe somebody who did you wrong in the past, or maybe somebody who agitates you. And you wouldn't treat them the same. You wouldn't receive the face the same, right? So to receive the face is to be partial, to say yes to this face, no to this face. To look at an external property, an external capacity, an external quantity, a contribution to the whole, and to then relate to that person who you are in charge of based upon what they give, right? And the exhortation is, if you're a Christian, that's not the economy with which you relate. The economy with which you relate is you see them and you as the same in this regard. It doesn't mean there's not a boss and there's not employees. It means similar to the idea that there's not slave nor free. Right? There's not male nor female. There's not Jew nor Greek. That is, that they are of a piece in two ways. One, that you're the same in regard to creation because you are created with the image of God. Secondly, you're the same in regard to the gospel because you both are in need of the gospel. Maybe you've received it, maybe they haven't. But you still stand as a sinner in need. You just have taken the provision of your need. They have yet to. And they have that opportunity as well. How much more would someone be availed that you're working with to the gospel if they saw you as the kind of person with the character of Christ, honoring, not using power as a manipulative tool, constantly relating to them as a treasured vessel created by God? Right? So let's let the gospel get all over the workplace in a new way. Father, I pray that you would bless us and encourage us, that you might help us to honor and glorify, lift up your name above all. That as we work some almost 15 years of our life, that you might use us in that capacity. There are people we work with right now that really need to know you, Lord. They need to experience your goodness and your grace. They need to know that they're loved by you. And I pray, Lord, that you would bless, that you would encourage, that you would strengthen, and that you would help us to be channels of your grace and mercy. And help us just to honor you with the sacrifice we make as it relates to our presence in the workplace. In Jesus' name, amen.